I am going to give you, because I love paper, but I figured just in case, I'm gonna give you a copy of the contract. Y'all at home will have to pull up on your computers copies of contracts. We're just gonna go purchase a sale today. And then I print out the pres in case you wanted to. Wow, I don't want to do weird stuff. In case you wanted to take notes on that. Trying to be all official now.
New year,
New year, new me. All right, it's only February. only took me a little while. Just reiterate, make sure you guys online can hear us.
Yes, they're nodding.
They're nodding. Okay, good. Because yeah, all right, well, we'll figure it out.
I was waiting for him to be loud.
Yeah, I'm nodding, no. Because you can see me on there too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's weird. All right. So we're going to talk about contracts today. We're going to talk specifically about the purchase and sale agreement. Now, before we get too far into find where my cursor is, because that's going to be a fun part.
Oh, it's on this screen currently.
Okay.
Maybe go the other way.
Oh, now I got it.
Okay.
All right, there I got it. Sorry. This new 3-screen thing is a little bit throwing. All right, so let's look at this, some basic concept about contracts. Number one is the one you really need to understand. The contract is the only thing that matters. What does that mean? This is a collaborative, so even online, guys, you guys are gonna have to talk. I'm trying to look over the screen.
If it's not written in the contract, it's not going to be enforceable.
Correct. If it's not in the contract, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't, I don't care if they said they're going to get you those condo docs. I don't care if they said they're going to include the piano in the sale of the house. I don't care what they said. If it's not written in the contract, it's not happening. Now, it might happen, but you can't make it happen. The second one is one of my favorites because most people think, oh, well, once I have an accepted contract, I'm good to go, right? Not necessarily. Contract can be voidable. And we'll talk about some things along the way as to why it could be voidable as we look at the different blanks and we look at the different options. An offer is countered. This is this is basic. Some of you, I think all of you are beyond this, but let's just make sure. We counter an offer, we amend a contract. So unless we're under contract, we're doing a counter. If we're under contract, then we're doing an amendment, right? Special stipulations, which we're going to have a whole class on, so don't get too involved today. But theoretically, you need to make sure that they have the who, what, when, consequences if not done, and they may need to be contractually removed. You can't just not do them. Right? If you change your mind or you decide to do something different, you have to amend the contract to get rid of them. Okay? Most situations occur as a result of poor verbiage, especially in the due diligence removal. Okay? So the amendment to address concerns, which we'll talk about as well at some point. Construction needs to follow the same guidelines as the special stipulations. If you remember, the who, what, when, consequence if not done, that will help you with your due diligence and amendment to address concern and things. Think about it. If I write it in the amendment to address concerns, fridge needs repair. I've seen it. Does that mean that the seller has to repair the fridge? I mean, maybe. Does the buyer need to repair the fridge? And what does repair the fridge mean exactly, right? It could mean a lot of things. So you need to be very specific about what you're asking, who you're asking, when you're asking, and what happens if they don't do it. Okay? We'll go into those in more detail as we get through the contract deeper on. Notifications, this is a key one. Notifications, the only thing in a contract that doesn't require both signatures. What's a great example of a notification that gets used very often and people think that it needs a signature? Anybody? I know, they're looking at you guys online. Come on now. You can participate.
Termination, notice to terminate.
Notice to terminate. Good one. Yes, that's the one I was thinking of. Because for some reason, people think that the unilateral notice to terminate needs the seller to sign off on it if the buyer terminates during due diligence, for instance. No, they need to sign the release at the bottom, which is a release, not a notice. So that form is kind of a gotcha form because it's got a notice on it and it has an agreement on the bottom part. So it's two pieces. Okay. Counteroffer forms, please, 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 please use counteroffer forms. Most of you are newer in the business enough that you probably don't remember the contract prior to counteroffer forms. But believe it or not, we used to do contracts where we didn't have a counteroffer form. And the preferred method was strike, fill in, initial. And imagine going back and forth 3 or 4 times on the same document, and you've got strikes and this and that and whatever all over the place, and it was messy. Which hence brings up the next one, just in case somebody says, hey, I need a cleaned up contract. No, you don't. If you use the original offer and the counter form, then you'd be fine. Okay, and we'll talk more about the counteroffer form a little later. The other thing that is good as you're talking about the contract and how it goes. The loop, your file, is the place for you to keep a record of everything that happens. So for instance, you have an email chain going back and forth with the listing agent, going over detail after detail after detail after detail of why you did this, why you agreed to that, why you wanted to do this, whatever. Do you think that it might be helpful to load that into the loop just in case in the future something comes back and somebody says, well, you told us. No, I said, what do you want to do? And you said you wanted to do this, so that's what we did. We had one the other day. We have one that just terminated that the buyers lost their mind, as sometimes happens. And they terminated the contract. We tried to explain to them that they were going to lose their earnest money, that they had other consequences, they could potentially owe commission. And so the listing agent said, look, we're going after the commission. And so we negotiated and got it down, and managed to not have to have them pay the full commission on a $600,000 purchase. But they're paying money to both brokerages, and they're having to pay additional option money that they were supposed to pay to the seller during the contract, and they're losing their earnest money. You know what helped our case is we had a text thread that said, I don't think you should terminate this or do this because the contract says you were supposed to be doing this. And they said, no, we're going to do that anyway. Okay. Right. So protect yourself, especially when you are dealing with contract terms or explaining things. Put it in writing so that you have protection. Now, here's the catch to that. If what you're saying is not good, you shouldn't put it in writing. You shouldn't also say it, right? So if you don't feel comfortable putting it in writing, you probably shouldn't say it. Make sense? All right. Let's go on to the first part of the contract. So what we're going to do, just to give everybody a heads up, we are going to do number by number by number through the contract. And we're going to look at, and in this case, it's 2 pages, but we're going to look at the contract itself, the fill in the blank section, and then we'll jump to the section that explains that, okay? Because all too often, classes, agents, brokers focus on the first page that has all the blanks on it and don't talk about what do the blanks mean. And so we're going to go in and talk about what the blanks mean. I will say at this point, I always, always, always recommend that you read through the contract at least once a year. I'm going to make sure my phone is off just as. Um, so that, I mean, because otherwise you're going to miss what something says. Little things get changed. I know we do a training class every year, but little things get missed. So we're going to go section by section. Before we get into the numbers, there's this field here at the top. Derek's looking at me like, what?
No.
It's pretty straightforward. It says offer date, right? Like,
Maybe it's not so
it's pretty
straightforward.
straightforward. So here's the thing. Why is that date important? This is interactive. I need some feedback.
That's the date where it starts, like the, oh God, what is the word that I'm trying to use?
Like
No.
binding agreement?
Yes, like it's gonna be.
No.
Nope,
'cause I'm-
nothing to
No.
do with that. Nothing to do with that.
That,
Good try. Good
that
try.
date, that date rolls forward to on every form, every exhibit, everything ties back to that offer date.
It is. That is the identifier. See, that's why it's good to have an experienced person, right? She helps us move forward.
Yeah.
When I throw out the real stumpers, that date is what identifies this specific offer. If you've been doing this business for any length of time, you have written multiple offers on the same property for the same client. It happens, right? Like it's just part of the business. The only way to distinguish between offer one and offer two is the offer date. Okay. And so whenever you're going to do a fresh offer and try again, which is often happens, right? Like you made an offer to the seller didn't respond. It's died because it went past the expiration date, and you want to try again because you've talked to the listing agent. So now you have an idea. Oh yeah, okay, we're going to try and do this. You can use the same one in loop, right? Like you can just change the few things you want to change, but you must change the date at the top because it's a different offer. Okay. And that will help identify. And as Robin pointed out, you then also need to change the offer date reference on anything else that references back to this offer. Okay. I know it's taking us a long time to get through the first box on the first page. I told you this was going to be in depth, right? So we're going to go pretty deep. All right, let's talk about the first box. The first box is purchase and sale, undersigned, and basically this box is to identify what we're selling, right? Part A, pretty straightforward. We put in an address, city, county, zip code, MLS number if there is one. Now, what if it's only in Georgia MLS? You would just put the Georgia MLS number, right? Just let's see there. Some of the numbers are going to be easier than others. And then tax ID is always super helpful. We remember in the first slide we talked about the contract being voidable. If I put all the stuff here in section A and I don't fill out section B at all, what's wrong with my contract? What stage is my contract? Everybody signs it. Both sellers and buyers have signed it. Is it a closable contract? So a little bit of a catch. It's not closable, but it is voidable.
Voidable.
Okay. So there's a slight difference between those two statements. Closings fix a lot of things. And Marcy, is Marcy on? I don't think Marcy's on. Marcy would kill me for saying this because a lot of problems that you have with a contract, like if you didn't do it right, die with the closing. As soon as they sign the closing, the contract dies, right? There's only a handful of things that survive. And when we get to that section, we'll talk about that. But if you didn't fill this out and everybody just moves forward, goes to closing and signs the closing, then you're fine. But as a listing agent, you never want to accept a contract that has a spot that the buyer could just say 2 days before closing, this contract's voidable, I void it, and get my money back. Wait, what? Well, there's no legal description. So you always want to have a solid enforceable contract. The other piece is this. This contract now has the section in it with the condo stuff. There used to be a completely separate contract for condos. Now, all we do is we add a condo resale, purchase and sale exhibit. So if it's a condo, you just check 2 and then fill that out, right? And that has some legal description stuff on. Where do you get the deed book and page? Which happens to be my favorite legal description, by the way. Do you know why it's my favorite legal description? Short and sweet. I don't have to have a separate page. I don't have to have relied on that I didn't pick the wrong thing of the wrong book, blah, blah, blah. Filling in this last section, section 4, which is, by the way, that used to be the only option, really. And I mean, trying to fill in even half of these blanks on most properties is a challenge, right? Because you might know the land lot and the district, but did you know how many houses are in a land lot in a district? Like, you need almost all of this information in order to really identify the individual property. And so a lot of agents get away with, and they fill this out and they put like 2 or 3 numbers in here and they think they're good. But if you only identify the landlocked and district, that's probably 50 or 100 houses. So that's not really a functional legal description for selling this particular property, right? So deed book and page, super easy. In your MLS and your tax records, if you find the document number for the last real sale, it will say document number and it will be number/number or number-number. That is deed book-page. Okay. And you can log into the gsccca.org and pull that up if you want to look at it. But that's that. Questions about the blanks?
Brett, I have a question
All righty.
for you.
I'm scared. Go ahead.
No. It's the condominium, that resale, purchase and sale exhibit.
Yes.
I was actually in a class one time and it was recommended, like, don't even use it, not to use it, just because because you're transferring information about the page number, the floor plan number, and that sort of thing. And so that person recommended, like, just, putting the deed book in the page or
Even if
attaching
it's
the
a condo?
exhibit. Is it? Yeah.
So here's my concern with that. So the condo resale, purchase and sale exhibit, which we'll go over as we do exhibits later, but it's a good question, is the only thing that talks about the transfer of access to like common area. And so that would be, I mean, I guess technically that's in the deed book and page. I don't know. That's a good one. Why don't we table that until we get to that exhibit, because we'll go through all the exhibits. But that is a good, I mean, technically doing the deed book and page, you're covering everything. But I would bet that Seth would say to go ahead and use the condo description. I mean, the condo resale and purchase exhibit. But we'll look at it closer when we get there. So hang on to that one. That was a good question. Anything else on the blank side? And I know I didn't answer your question, but
No worries.
That's all I got. That's all I got. All right, so let's go to the actual paragraph that supports this section, because it's important to understand. When you are working with a seller, you should have them understand what this says, because the seller is warranting that at the time of closing, they're going to convey good and marketable title, subject only to these things. It's important that they understand. For me, when I was a listing agent, I would have this, I would show this to the seller. I would say, are any of these things going to be an issue? Right? Some of the more exciting ones are, improvements that do not encroach. Any encroachments that you know of. Any kind of things that in the declarations of the covenants and condos, right? Like, we need to get those. any leases or other encumbrances on the property? Oh, yeah, I got a lien for blah, blah, blah. Okay, good. Now, when we're listing it, is the time to find out about that so that we don't get to closing and realize, oh, you have to bring $100,000 to closing and you don't have it. So I did my job. I got the property sold, and now we can't do it. Right? So you have to ask those in here. Examination, what's that mean?
I get to look at documents. and-
So the buyer can examine both title and a survey of the property. So do I need to put in a special stipulation that says the buyer can get a survey? Nope.
No,
So this paragraph says that the buyer is going to examine title and can get a survey. They don't have to do either of those things. They should do the title one for sure. And if they're getting a loan, that's going to be an automatic, obviously. And in a lot of cases, they should get a survey. I'm one of those weird people that doesn't believe in surveys on everything. But there's specific weirdness about that.
What do you believe in surveys on?
If there's something that you're concerned about on a property, I would get a survey. If you're buying a piece of property that's large, that, maybe 2 or 3 acres, and you aren't really sure if your property goes all the way to the creek or not, or like those kinds of things, I would get a survey. If you're buying a piece of property in town and it's kind of hard to tell where the back of the lot ends, and you're concerned about as a buyer, see, this is where we start to get into. When I say you're concerned, I'm not talking about you as the agent. I'm talking about you as the buyer, right? If the buyer is concerned where the back of the property ends, right? Maybe there's a fence that goes across the back of the property. Is that the actual property line? Because it looks like there's a bunch of vacant space behind it. Might be an alleyway that was abandoned, right? So in those cases, a buyer might choose, again, buyer gets to choose if they want to do a survey. Not us, okay? But this paragraph says they have the right to, okay? And then if they have any objections, title objections prior to closing, they can submit a written statement. Then this paragraph says the seller has to fix those things. If they can't fix those things, they can use the unilateral extension. Then the buyer can, if they want, terminate the agreement without any penalty, which means they get their earnest money back. And then, of course, it defines a little bit what good marketable title is, which basically just means you can get title insurance. Okay, so that doesn't mean there isn't an encroachment. It just means that you can get title insurance. And it's kind of funky. Standard exceptions, you might have pre-written over something, it might have already been there. There's weird things like that. Speaking of title insurance is the last thing. Buyer hereby directs any mortgage lender involved in the transaction to quote cost title insurance based upon the presumption the buyer will be obtaining an enhanced title insurance policy. Why? Why does it say enhanced?
more protection.
More protection, because your basic title policy is basically useless. That's why it's called basic. So, any questions about the warranty, examination, or title insurance?
Yes,
Okay,
this is Dan. B and C, when we talked about the title and then the enhanced policy,
yep,
the real estate attorneys will say, the current survey would help out in the case of title issues. The practical matter in a seller's market is the buyer is going to be pressured to compress their due diligence. And with trying to schedule a survey, what happens? What would you suggest if you can't get enough time to obtain a survey on a practical basis? Like how would you address that?
all right.
To
So that's
protect
a
the
good
buyer?
question. That's an excellent question. Often getting a survey done in a 5-day due diligence time period is just not an option, right? Getting the home inspection scheduled, is enough of an effort. Getting a survey done is really quite a challenge. And so what this contract and what these paragraphs actually say is that I don't have to get the survey done during due diligence. Now, here's the issue. If the survey comes back with some kind of weird encroachment that creates a title issue, then I can go back to the seller at any point prior to closing and say, you have a title issue. If like for instance, we had a survey not too long ago where it looked like the sewer line went underneath the house. By the way, you can't build a house on top of a sewer line, right? Because what happens if they have to service the sewer line? They just cut up your house. Like, I mean, it's bad. So, but we had a survey that looked like the sewer line was too close to the house. Might have even gone under the house. It's hard to tell in the original plans. So they wanted a new survey. If we had gotten that new survey and it had shown that that pipe actually went directly under the house, that would be a title objection. And so it doesn't matter that my due diligence is over because I have a title objection. And title objections don't have to stay within due diligence. That's why when the attorneys do their title search, they don't care if they get that done during due diligence. It doesn't matter. Does that answer your question?
Well, just to play off of that quickly,
Yeah.
what if the buyers, don't want to go forward when they hear what's revealed by a survey as a title objection?
So
Do they have
that
an option?
So that, well, if it's a title, if it actually is a title objection, and so that's the thing, right? A survey can reveal title issues, but it can also just reveal things that the buyer didn't realize and now doesn't want, right?
Yeah, like for example, if the fence isn't the actual boundary and,
Correct.
then, and they say, well, I don't want it now because I thought I had more property.
So at that point, you're going to want to use a special stipulation. And when we go through special stipulations, remind me to bring up one about surveys,
Okay.
and we'll talk about it. But if you're just worried about title objections, like, encroachments and those sorts of things, then this paragraph actually allows you to get that survey at any point prior to closing. And if there's an issue, get it resolved or be able to walk away.
Good.
Okay?
Good.
All right. Good. All right. Next one. We're going to do 2 and 1. This should hopefully go a little faster. Purchase price. This one should go pretty quick. Purchase price, pretty straightforward. You have to put a number in there. Now, it sounds very obvious. Believe it or not, I've seen contracts that have other things in there other than numbers. So I have seen a contract that said TBD. To be determined. Right, what do I mean? Why do I keep saying that? If I have a contract, going back to my first slide, I have a contract that has TBD in that field or just about any field in the entire contract. Is that contract voidable? Absolutely.
Yes.
In fact, it may not even be a valid contract to begin with, right? It may not be even remotely enforceable. That needs to be a number. Okay, I know that sounds pretty obvious, but that needs to be a number. The purchase price has to be paid in US dollars. If you're dealing with foreign entities, please point that out. It has to be in US dollars. Delivery acceptable to the closing attorney, including but not limited to wire transfer of immediately available funds. And where this agreement refers to sales price, it shall mean the same thing as the purchase price. So sales price, purchase price, same thing. One of the most simple parts of the whole contract. Okay. Any questions about that one? Okay, good. We'll move on. Closing cost, seller's contribution at closing. This one gets a little more complicated because on the first page, it looks pretty straightforward. It's just a little box. It only takes up one side of the page. It can't be that important. It's hugely important. Look at how much paragraph is covered, right? So obviously that's a number that you put in. Again, can't be a percentage, can't be, I've seen all kinds of weird crap put in there. It needs to be a dollar number. That's why there's a dollar sign at the front. It needs to be $1, not all of it, Which I'm like, all of it. Okay, great. So let's look at the paragraphs. Seller's contribution at closing. So at closing, the seller shall make the reference seller's monetary contribution, which is on that page, which the buyer may use to pay any cost or expense of buyer related to this transaction, including, without limitation, any commission obligations of the buyer. Buyer acknowledges that the buyer's mortgage lenders may not allow the seller's monetary contribution or the full their amount to be used for some costs or expenses. In such event, any unused portion of the seller's monetary contribution shall remain the property of the seller. That is a very important point. Because buyers, when they fill out that first page, they're like, all right, I'm going to pay you $100,000 for your house and I'm going to get $10,000 in closing costs. Oh, by the way, you only have $2,000 in closing costs. So now I, Mr. Seller, get $98,000. Wait, you were supposed to give me $10,000. That's not how it works. You need to explain that to your clients. You need to make sure that they're reading these things because they need to understand that just because they put a dollar number in that box doesn't mean they're going to get it all. Because the other thing in this paragraph that I breezed right through was that the lender may say, you can't use all that. So I got $10,000 in closing costs. And oh, by the way, I'm getting an FHA loan and the only maximum amount I can get is 6%. Crap, I can only get $6,000, even though the contract says 10. Right? One of the things that's interesting in here is I don't think this little sentence used to be in here, the any commissions or obligations of the buyer. I don't remember that being in there. Robin, do you remember that being in there?
No.
I don't even think that came up during our class on the whole
No.
thing.
Mm-mm.
Because obviously now with the way that we're doing with commissions, if I just up this dollar amount and the lender's okay with it to cover my buyer's commission expense, whether it's a difference or all of it, right? Like whatever it is, then I'm covered, right? I can use that. So that's interesting. Again, make sure the lender is okay and can handle that. Always have conversations with lender. It pains me, and I'm going to say it now because this is a great place to say it. It pains me how many people try to hide stuff from lenders because they're worried lenders are going to blow up the deal. If the lender's going to blow up the deal, it's probably because you're trying to commit mortgage fraud. I'm just saying, like that's my experience. 90% of the time, not always, 90% of the time, lender's only going to blow up the deal if you're trying to commit mortgage fraud. Which they should. Okay? You should be having conversations with lenders about, hey, my client needs to do this. Is that going to be okay with the loan type that they have? Because one of the reasons that we don't have a mortgage company and we don't think we should get into any of that and be lenders and real estate agents is because their shit is super complicated. I've been doing this for 20 years now, and I can barely tell you the basics about the way mortgage works. I surely can't tell you the details of what the requirements are for this program versus that program versus this program. And I don't want to, because that's their job. Now, there used to be a time in real estate where real estate agents would print out amortization tables and give their clients the amortization table on what their payments were going to be for the 30 years of the loan. It's on the test, right? It's a complete waste of your time because we don't have to do that. That is not something that we as real estate agents should do. Always defer to the expert. So ask questions about closing costs. Don't just assume that, well, if I write a number in here, they'll get it. Because I've also seen some very savvy listing agents know more than the buyer agent. And the buyer agent says, oh, I'm going to get $10,000 in closing costs on a $100,000 house. The listing agent's like, no, you're not. All right, whatever. Like, go with it. So, things to think about. Additional items paid by the seller. In addition to the above, the seller also has to pay fees and costs of the closing attorney to prepare and record the title curative documents. So if there was something wrong with the title that they need to cure, for the seller not attending the closing in person, it's important to point out when you're doing a listing presentation, hey, are you going to be in town still when the closing happens? Because you will have to pay extra if you don't. Okay? And to handle and deliver sellers' payoffs and proceeds. Those are those little recording fees and whatever things that they throw on there. Seller cost, regardless of, even if this box says 0, this paragraph is things the seller is going to have to pay for. So make sure that you're pointing those things out. As a general comment, when you're doing a listing presentation, you should give the seller a copy of the purchase and sale agreement so they can look over it. When you do a buyer presentation, you should give the buyer a copy of the purchase and sale agreement so they can look over it before you're trying to go under contract under a deadline, right? Let them read it, have questions, because you want them to read all of this stuff. 90% of people, maybe all stats are made, 90% of stats are made up, right? Just as a side note. A ton of people, unfortunately, love to use this little thing called a cell phone, where they pull up their electronic document and they sign it. Do you know how hard it is to read all this stuff on a cell phone? I guarantee you they're not doing it, right? They're not even trying. They hit next, go to the next signature. Okay, initials, sat, done. Okay, done. What did I just sign? No idea. Right? So please give them a copy of this to read before. That way they know what they're signing. And if they have questions or concerns, they can bring them up and you can help. Okay? Items to be paid by the buyer. This is important. The buyer has to pay Georgia property transfer tax, the cost of title search and tax records, and prepare a limited warranty deed, and all other costs, fees, and charges that could close or related to the transaction. So basically that just says everything but these things they have to pay. Now, the stuff from here in that box can pay for these if they get it, if the seller agrees to pay. Prorations. Have you ever had a client that you closed and they came back and say, my tax bill was way higher than they thought it was supposed to be? Like maybe their homestead exemption went away or something. And I'm out like an extra $5,000 or $6,000 or $10,000. That's what this does. This talks about what the prorations, how the prorations are going to be handled, and then how you come back and fix them after the fact. Okay. As you're more experienced and you do more and more closings, you will find that certain times of the year make this paragraph a big pain in the ass and other parts of the year don't. Battery's running low. I guess I should plug it in then. So from that standpoint, let's talk about it. Robin, what do you think from a standpoint of what time of year is a good time of year to be worried about prorations, and when is it less likely to be an issue?
Well, it's less likely right after the tax bills are out.
Yeah. So as soon as the tax bills are released, this is the most accurate time. It's the most valid. And so typically those tax bills are released in the fall. So typically October, but now here's the trick. The worst time is right before they're released. Because they might be different than what you thought they were going to be. They're now literally as far out as possible in being accurate. So they change year to year. Maybe the previous homeowners moved out, so you got to ask questions. Like, was the home still occupied? If the home is vacant and you're buying the home in February or March, when was the home vacated? Was the home still occupied as of January 1st? Because if it wasn't, then your clients who are buying it now might have a lot larger homestead tax, lack of homestead exemption, which would be a tax cost. Make sense? Questions about closing cost?
Yes.
Okay,
Dan again, in A, where it says, the buyer can use for any cost or expense related to the transaction.
yep,
Often buyers will pay the lender for a appraisal fee or some other fee. And
Yep.
if it's paid outside of closing, it could actually become an adjustment on the settlement statement.
correct.
Okay, so then the second thing is, and I think we've gone by this, is the new section that says, including without limitation any commission obligations of the buyer.
Yes,
And then we go on to say, whatever the lender will approve. Do we
correct.
have any clarity on that? Because sometimes the commission is substantially more than the seller's contribution.
No, I don't think we can have clarity on that because I think every mortgage lender is going to be different. And I think that's where you have to have that communication with them, because if they're not, like, every lender is going to be different in how they handle that. And so one lender might be perfectly fine with it and have no issue. And another lender might say, well, the maximum contribution can be only this, even though it's applied to something else. Like, I think we're just gonna have to play that by ear as that expands. Obviously, the ability to include commission obligations in that, or really anything related to the transaction, like you said, appraisal costs, whatever that they might have paid outside of closing that the attorney can then roll in. You're gonna have to have that experience with the lenders. You're gonna have to have that conversation. It's the only way to even promote idea.
Can we ask that up front?
Absolutely, I would.
So that
Yes.
know what's allowable?
Yep. Absolutely, I would, especially if you're writing, a contract where you're gonna have additional things. Because this is the other part of it is that, like, in theory, if I'm paying the lender points to reduce my interest rate, that's covered, right?
Yes.
But again, the lender might say, well, the maximum contribution you can get from a seller on this program is X. And so have that conversation up front with the lender. The lender needs to be a part of your team working with your buyer. Okay?
Good.
Good question. All right, moving on. 4, closing date and possession. This, again, should be pretty straightforward, right? We pick a date, we put the actual date in that box. Then here's an important thing. We need to check one of the next boxes. So we either need to check possession is going to be upon closing or X number of days after closing at a certain time period. Oh, and by the way, if you put a number in here and you're using this section, please check AM or PM. Again, if I wrote in there 4 days after closing and I don't put a number or an AM or PM, what happens? Contract could
End
be
of the
voidable,
day.
for one, because it's not clear. What does that mean? Right?
Probably the end of the day.
Probably, but anytime you're going to use that phrase, and thank you for saying it, and I'm not picking on you, but when you say probably going to be, you're probably in trouble. Because should never have to say, oh, that probably means this. It needs to. The contract is the only thing that matters. The
Check the
contract
box.
to say exactly what it's going to be, not probably. So if you need to interpret it, put more info in. Okay? So to that point, fill out all the boxes. Right? All right. So let's talk about these 3 paragraphs that go heavily with this. Right to extend the closing date. This is a very, very important paragraph. Because many people, I have arguments with brokers, it drives me insane,
Do that for me, last
using the unilateral extension. Was that one of yours?
One of mine.
Yours not the only one. I've had it for years. Unilateral extension. Because I wanted to. Man, that doesn't work. This paragraph says very clearly what you can do. Buyer or seller may unilaterally extend the closing for 8 days. Does it say up to 8 days? Does it say around 8 days? No, it says 8 days. So it doesn't say I can extend the closing for 4 days. It extends the closing for 8 days. Does that mean I can close earlier than that? Absolutely. You can always close earlier than the closing date, but you have to agree upon it. But this extension is for 8 days, only 8 days. Upon notice to the other party, given prior to the date, prior to or on the date of closing, which is a real jackass move. by the way. Especially when you have people coming back to town for a closing. Seen it done, makes everybody angry. Seller, number one, the seller cannot satisfy a valid title objection. Excluding title objections that, this is important, can be satisfied through the payment of money or by bonding off the same. And B, do not prevent the seller from conveying good and marketable title as that term is defined herein to the property. Those are two very important statements. If the seller has a lien on the property for $10,000, that is not a valid reason for them to extend the closing 8 days. Because they just need to write a check for $10,000. That's how it works. If there's some kind of weird thing that's a title objection, so to speak, but it's not enough of a title objection, and we are not going to go deep into title objections as we skimmed over it enough already. But for whatever reason, they can still get good and marketable title and title insurance, then that's not a valid reason to extend for 8 days. Okay. Number two, we get the buyer's reason. The buyer's mortgage lender, including in transactions where the financing contingency has expired or the closing attorney is delayed and cannot fulfill their respective obligations by the date of the closing, provided that the delay is not caused by the buyer. Very important little set of words. Provided that the delay is not caused by the buyer. If the buyer just didn't submit their paperwork when the lender asked for it, it ain't gonna work. Now, I've seen people get away with it. Again, people get away with all kinds of things, but that ain't it. You need to read this to your buyers and your sellers so they understand what their real things are. Number three is the buyer has not received required estimates or disclosures prohibited from closing under federal regulations. Most of you have operated mostly in that time frame. Some of us have been around before that actually happened. And so we could close stuff literally the next day. You got to have 3 days to look at your crap now. That's just the way it is. The party unilaterally extending the closing date shall state the basis for the delay in the notice of extension. Remember, it says notice. Does a notice need 1 or 2 signatures? Just one party, right? Just the buyer side or seller side. The seller if the right to unilaterally extend the closing is exercised once by either the buyer or the seller, the right shall therefore terminate. So here's the fun part. Seller has a title issue. They extend the closing 8 days. For some reason, that jacks up the lender and the loan and the closing. No more unilateral extensions. Doesn't matter that there's a valid reason. It's gone. You can only use it once in a transaction. Whoever uses it first gets it. But it has to be used for a valid reason. Now, one of the things I like about the new language that's in here is that it says including transactions where financing contingency has expired. It used to say including transactions where it's cash. And so brokers would say, oh, well, I have a cash deal and I'm having trouble getting my cash together. I'm going to do a unilateral extension. Nope. When you fill out this contract, the buyer is saying they have all the money and cash that they need to make the closing happen. Unless they state otherwise. Okay, so this cannot be used if the buyer just doesn't have the money. That is not a valid reason. Oh, I thought I was gonna get that bonus, was gonna use it for the down payment. It didn't come through. I just need a few more days. It's late. Well, you hope that the seller is gonna agree to give you a few more days because you can't do unilateral. Okay. Questions about right to extend the closing? Online? Nothing? All right, good. Keys and openers. Again, this should be pretty straightforward, but keys and openers. At closing, seller should provide the buyer with all of them. Right? Now, I have seen people write in stipulations that say, at closing, seller provide alarm codes. What the hell would you do that for? It says it right here. Codes, access, and other similar equipment allowing access to the property, community, and community amenities. Condos, sometimes sellers have to return amenity access things to the condo association, and then the new buyer has to go get their own. So it says in here, in the event seller is required to return above items to a third party, seller shall provide buyer with instructions on how to contact that third party and obtain such items. So I have to return my mailbox key and my pool key and my whatever. It's not super common, but it does happen. Devices and fixtures. This is one of my favorites. Except for a set forth above, in other words, if you say something different. If a system, device, or fixture conveyed with the property cannot be operated without a specific controller, then not later than the time of possession, seller will provide buyer with all controllers which are required to operate those devices. So we already talked about door openers and, you know, all that kind of stuff. What are we talking about? Anybody ever seen a ceiling fan that operates with a remote control? Yeah. What if it's not there? Oh, I packed up. Oh, I packed that up when I was packing. Sorry. I mean, I need that to operate the damn light, right? Like I can't turn the light on and off because it only works with the remote. I've got those super fancy shades that, you know, and it goes, yeah, I want those so bad. One day when I grow up. If I need a remote for that, I need a remote, right? Or if there's some code for the system or whatever, maybe there's an iPad that's the controller for the whole system. You got to give me the damn iPad, right? Like it's part of the systems. That's basically what all this says. Sellers can reset things. They can give codes. There's a couple different options in here as to how they are going to convey those things, right? I use my own passwords on stuff. I don't need to give you my passwords. I can reset it to factory defaults. I can change the password to something else. Like there are a bunch of different options. Any questions about that?
Brett, another one is thermostats.
Thermostats, yes, the smart thermostat, right? Well, pretty much all the smart stuff. So my side note story, I've gotten a new washer and dryer recently. I have a new thermostat, garage door opener in the last number of years. All of them connect to my phone. It's cool until you buy my house and they're all still connected to my phone, right? That's weird. And that's sort of what this section talks about, is you need to make sure that there's some conveyance of that and really also some way for the buyer to say, hey, Mr. Seller, I don't want you looking at what temperature my house is and controlling it every day, right? Like, I don't want you to have that access. I don't want you to get notified every time my garage door opens and closes. Or as my wife would say, please don't get notified. Laundry gets done, because that gets really annoying. It sends me things that say, the laundry has been in the washer for 30 minutes damp. FYI, it's really not good for a relationship to tell the other person that. But the phone said, never mind. All right, moving on. Good point. Smart devices. All right, closing law firm, closing attorney. Phone number. Didn't used to have that number thing in there, but thank God those are both on there. So you need to put the name of the closing attorney. Is that Brett Duffy or is that Duffy Law in whatever?
Duffy Law.
Right. It should be Duffy Law. Now you can do Duffy Law dash Brett Duffy if you want, but inherently you don't know for sure that that's going to be the person that does the closing. So really you should just put the firm name, which is why it says law firm. And then you put the phone number to the office that you're going to be using. So say you're using Wiseman or Campbell and Brannon or Fryer or any of the bigger firms that have, 12, 15, 20, 30 offices around the city. I don't know. Pick the number for the one that you want to go to, because that's kind of how you tell the other agent, this is the office we're going to be using instead of the office that you think we're going to be using. Because I can't tell you how many times somebody says, oh yeah, we're closing at such and such law firm. Great, it's right down the street from the house. Oh no, we're closing at the one in Buckhead. I know the house is in LJ, but we're going to close at the one in Buckhead. Wait, so you want my sellers to drive all the way from LJ to Buckhead to close this? Oh my God, really?
Right?
Who would do that? I don't know anybody that would do that. But so those are the things you gotta pay attention. That's why the phone number needs to be the right phone. All right, we talked about the closing law firm. The buyer shall have the right to select a closing attorney. How many times have you seen a listing that says use blah blah blah? It should say preferred closing attorney is such and such. Sometimes people get a little ambitious and they say must use such and such as the closing attorney. Not necessarily legal, because the buyer has the right to select a closing attorney. Blah blah blah. Individual attorney employed by owner. Blah blah blah. This talks about the different attorneys are acceptable. Basically, this talks about the fact that the attorney, while the buyer gets to choose them, unless it's a cash deal, the attorney doesn't represent the buyer. Attorney represents the lender. If it's a lender deal, attorney represents the lender. Now, we all know that the person that has the best relationship with the attorney gets the best support. It's just human nature, right? So just be aware of that. Any questions about this section? Because I want to try and finish here in the next 2 seconds, which is going to be a trick because I have like 2 more pages. We can stop if we have to, but the next 2 I think we can get through somewhat quickly. They're not maybe, they're kind of a big deal. Earnest money is kind of a big deal. Let's talk about holder of earnest money. If the holder is a closing attorney, then you must attach 510 and 511 must be signed by the closing attorney. Those are 2 very important things. If you choose to use a closing attorney, then you have to attach 510 to this contract. If it's not there, that's a problem. And then you have to get 511 signed and share with everybody. Okay? Who should be the holder of the earnest money? Buyer's broker, that's an option. Unless the buyer's broker is somebody that doesn't hold earnest money, which is also an option. If you're the listing agent, who do you want to hold the earnest money?
Remax.
Your broker, ideally. Why do you want, and this is a stupid statement, but why would you want to be the one, your brokerage, me, controlling the earnest money?
In case there's a dispute.
In case there's a dispute. That's the number one reason. So if there's a dispute, you know that I'm going to do what the contract says and I'm going to be legit. You don't know that the person on the other end might do that. Now, there are remedies for that, but it's a pain in the ass, right? So if you have ABC brokerage it's just me. I would use my name, but that's actually somebody else's brokerage, so we won't talk. If it was just me brokerage. And it's just, I'm the only person in it, right? Like one of those one person brokerages, which there are a lot of. And I'm holding the earnest money. Is there a chance that I might not do the right thing in a dispute? Very, very much.
I figured that. I got it. Thank you.
Now, in a, what about just having the closing attorney hold it? I'm an okay with the closing attorney holding it, as long as you know who the closing attorney is and how they do it. There are closing attorneys. Now, forms say certain things, and we'll get to those, and I probably should have added those in here, but we'll get to them when we do exhibits. There are closing attorneys that will say that unless I have written agreement between the parties, I'm not going to disperse earnest money. So if you have a problem, y'all figure it out and come back and tell me when you're ready. That's bad. It's bad for your client no matter what. So you need to have conversations with attorneys, just like you have conversations with lenders. You need to have conversations with attorneys. Hey, by the way, what's your thoughts on handling earnest money before you have them hold it? Because here's the other thing. If I write this contract and I say that Duffy Law is going to hold the earnest money, and then I go to Duffy Law to get the 511 signed, and Duffy Law says, well, we don't hold earnest money. It's going to make your life more complicated. You have backup and you have blah, blah, blah. But like, you could have skipped that whole drama by just making a phone call. Right? So make the phone call. Questions about earnest money? All right. I think the last one is more on earnest money. So I think I'll stop and we'll do that the next time. We'll start there. Questions about what we've done so far? Is this good? Is this helpful? Okay. Even for you super experienced folks like Robin, are you good? Dan?
Mhm,
Yes.
absolutely.
All right, good. I always think reviewing the contract in depth every so often is a really good idea. That first statement on the first page, I cannot reiterate more than I can. The contract is the only thing that matters. When you are representing your client, if you're not writing a good, solid, verifiable, justifiable, defendable contract, you are doing them a disservice. No matter who they are, buyers or sellers. Okay? You should be able to stand in front of a judge and explain why the contract says what it says because you wrote it. If you can't, then you need to get help. One of the things that we're here for is to help with contract things. One of the things that our attorneys that we work with, whether they're people that you work with every day or people that I work with every day, you should develop a relationship with an attorney that you can call and ask questions. I have several. And occasionally I have to pull out the big guns. I try not to because it's so much more effort. But I have several attorneys that I can just call and say, hey, you're the expert on this. If this says this, what does that mean? Right? Because that's confusing. So fill it out right to begin with, and it will save you so much time and energy. Next week, we'll start with the rest of earnest money and go through the rest of the front page and all the language that goes with it. I think it's next week, right? Yeah.
A
Okay.
sales meeting.
Oh, we have sales meeting next week, so it's the week after. Yeah, that's why I was trying to. Thank you, Dan, because that's what in my head I had that. I knew I had a conflict of something. So, all right. Thank you all for coming. Please remember that if you have questions, and if we go back to the very first screen, we are not lawyers. These are opinions and interpretations, right? Just a little CYA here. If you need help, you should talk to your broker or attorney. Okay? Thank you much. Appreciate you all coming.